Hi everyone, welcome to this flipped preview video for English class. This is Mrs. Alexander, and today we're going to be talking about writing narratives. So you've probably written a narrative before, you've probably read a narrative before, and narratives can come in a variety of different ways. So let's get started with this lesson. So, what are narratives? Well, narratives explain events that are connected to each other in a story. So, in other words, a narrative is another word for the word story. So, like I said, you probably have written narratives before, you've definitely read narratives before. But today we're going to talk about the elements that go into a narrative. We'll talk about certain things to keep in mind as you're writing, depending on the purpose for your writing or how you are writing a narrative, what it's for. Okay, so let's look at the elements of a narrative. So this may have been referenced before in a writing assignment called a personal narrative. That would be a narrative about yourself. There are other types of narratives. You might write a narrative about somebody else's event. But nonetheless, let's look at the elements of a narrative. So we have the elements of a narrative here. Let's go ahead and zoom in. So a narrative needs to have a beginning, middle, and an end. Now, we'll talk about that when we talk about plot in just a moment. But again, it needs to have a clear beginning, middle, and end. This is going to mean that you are writing in chronological order. You might have heard of this pattern of organization before. Chronological means it goes first, next, third, so on and so forth. Okay, the other thing you need to have is context or a setting. We'll get into the details of what you need to keep in mind when creating your setting for your narrative. You also need to make sure you have a point of view. Now, this could be first, second, or third person point of view. I like to abbreviate point of view sometimes with just POV. And we'll talk about the different points of views that you may need to write in depending on your writing assignment or choose to write in depending on what you want for your narrative. Now, a narrative also needs to have characters, okay? So if you're talking about a personal event, you need to make sure you have characters. Now, these may be real characters, real people, or they may be fictional characters because your narrative could also be fictional depending on what the purpose for your writing is. Okay, again, you need to have plot. Again, we'll get into that in just a little bit, and a conclusion that ties into a beginning, middle, and end. You need to have a resolution, a wrap up of your narrative. Now, narratives can be true or not true. So, depending on your assignment or why you're writing your narrative, you can decide, or your writing assignment will decide for you whether or not it should be true or not true. Okay, so when we talk about point of view, let's look at over here to point of view. Okay, so point of view. As stories, works of fiction have a narrative, a narrator, okay, who tells the story from a particular point of view. Now, you may have first person point of view. That means that you are telling the story. So you can use things like I or we. I went to the store. I won my baseball game. Okay. You also can have second person point of view. This would be you're talking to the reader. So you went down the road. You wrote a letter. Okay. And then you have another one that's common, which is third person point of view. This means that a narrator is telling the story about other people. So they're going to use things like he won the baseball game or she went to the carnival. Okay. So, more commonly in personal narratives, you're going to use one of these, either first person or third person. Okay, and we also were talking about beginning, middle, and end. Now, this may look familiar to you. This is called a plot diagram, okay? Or you may have heard it called Freytag's pyramid. There are a bunch of different words for it, but essentially it walks you through the different parts of a story, okay? So you might have written a fictional narrative before, a fictional story before. Okay, you need to have a beginning, okay? This is called the exposition. This is where your characters and your setting are usually introduced. Okay. After that, right here, it's not on here. You need to have a conflict. A conflict is usually introduced right after the exposition. Now, this is where the characters may run into a problem or something has to be solved. This is going to then drive the rest of your story events up, and this is called your rising action. So, after you've established the problem or the event that happened, maybe you got lost at sea, or maybe you uh, fell down and broke your ankle. Okay. So, whatever the conflict is, that might happen here. Now, if you fell down, that may also be considered the climax, which is the turning point of the story. But, anyways, we'll get there in a second. So, you have rising actions. This is going to lead to the middle of your story. It's going to be part of the middle of your story. And then something happens. There's a turning point in the story. It's the point of the story where the readers go, oh, okay, that's your climax. Then after that, people are going to continue reading your story, and there's going to be other events that happen in your story that lead to eventually a resolution. Now, those events that happen after the big turning point of the story, somebody once put it, one of my students once said, it's like a roller coaster, right? Your roller coaster, you're going up, you're going up, you're going up. When you get to the top, that's the big turning point, and then what happens afterwards? It's like your roller coaster is going down. Okay. And then your resolution doesn't always have to be a happy one. Hopefully it's a happy one. But it doesn't have to be happy. But this is your conclusion. So you'll notice here we have our beginning. Like I said, these events here are the middle, rising action, climax, and falling action. And then you have your resolution. You might also have heard of this called a denouement. Okay. But that is also going to come at the end of your story. All right, let's keep going talking about your narrative. Now, it could be fiction or nonfiction. Now, we know fiction is not real, it's made up. Okay, it might have some real things in it, but the event is not real. The characters may not be real. They have different names or so on and so forth. Nonfiction, however, is real, which non-fake, I mean. Okay, so that means it's real. Okay, now it might mean that this is a personal narrative, so you're describing an event that actually happened. Okay, so let's keep going. Now, let's talk about setting. When you're creating your personal narrative or any type of narrative that you're doing, story, you need to have a setting. So when you look at these pictures, don't you have an image in your mind of, wow, I wonder what's going on in the story in this setting? Okay. And notice that these settings require descriptive language. For this middle picture here, if I just said the beach, that's not really doing this photo justice. So that means you need to create vivid and descriptive settings that provoke sensory imagery in the reader's mind. Okay. That means that you need to use details when describing your setting. Okay. So here are things to keep in mind. What did it feel like? What is the feeling of my setting? Um, what did it look like? Okay. Now we can continue on with these questions. You can even not come up with questions on your own. But I think one thing to keep in mind is the senses. Okay. You have feel, touch, see, smell, and hear. Those are the sensory images that we want to provoke in our reader's mind. We want them to be able to imagine themselves in the setting. Okay. Point of view. We talked about point of view. You're going to choose whether it's first person point of view, second person point of view, or third person point of view. So that is deciding, do I want the narration to be subjective or objective? This would be more of the narrator's feelings involved. And when I say objective, that's going to be more factual. So this would be more of like a third person point of view, where if we want the narrator to have their feelings involved, then they probably need to be telling the story. So that would be more commonly seen in first person point of view. Okay. And do I want my narrator's thoughts, feelings to be a part of it? Again, that's really deciding between first person point of view or third person point of view. Now, your assignment may tell you what point of view to write it, or you might have the option. All right, now let's talk about your characters. You want your characters to be fully developed. You want them to have full descriptions. You want them to be full characters. So think about their personality. What do they look like? How do they act? Okay? You want your characters to be dynamic and your characters are developed throughout the narrative. Don't feel like you have to tell everything about the character right from the start. Obviously, characters are developed through the actions, through the setting, through the theme. All of those things help develop your characters throughout the story. Now, things to keep in mind. I really like this acronym. I want to go over this acronym. When developing your characters, keep this in mind, okay? CHAD. Think about their thoughts. What are their thoughts in the story? Are you going to convey those thoughts? Are you going to explain them? What actions do they do? And how do those actions develop who they are? You also really want to make sure you include dialogue, okay? The dialogue is something that one character says to another character. They're in quotation marks, okay? And you want to have description of your character. Now, there are formatting techniques when it comes to dialogue. So if you want to pause the video to review some of these formatting techniques, but nevertheless, dialogue, one way that it's seen is that you are going to put talking bubbles into quotation marks. Okay. Now, again, there are formatting rules to consider when adding dialogue to your narrative. Okay. So if you want to go ahead and pause the video to go over this excellent resource on formatting, please do. All right, and let's go back to descriptive language, okay? So descriptive language, you want to make sure you're being precise when explaining things in your narrative. So I wanted to give you an example. Okay, this sentence here, John went for a run. Not very descriptive. This sentence right here, on a smoldering hot mid-July day, John decided to venture outside for a long 3-mile run. Notice the descriptions that are added here. Okay, on a smoldering hot mid-July day, you'll notice that there should be commas separating those adjectives here. That's a key thing. When you're just having descriptive writing, you have adjectives. Those are describing words, okay, used throughout your narrative, throughout your writing. Okay, and as always, you want to make sure you're revising and editing your narrative or any type of writing before submitting it, before having that final product. So, here are some things to keep in mind. As you finish wrapping up your rough draft, you want to make sure you do these things. Have I checked the spell check or grammar check to ensure I have fixed or caught any errors? A lot of word processors or Google Docs, Microsoft Words, or Pages, most commonly, will have a spell check or a grammar check, and those will come up as squiggly lines. You want to make sure you check those. Not all the time are they correct. Remember, you're working with a computer here. They don't know everything. They know a lot, but you have to have that personable touch to your editing. You want to make sure that their suggestion that they have for your spelling error or grammatical error is correct, and then change those. Then you want to ask yourself, did I review the rules for punctuation and capitalization and check my work? So you want to make sure you're capitalizing the correct things like proper nouns, beginning of sentences, titles, and you want to make sure you're punctuating correctly. Are you using your commas correctly, your dialogue quotation marks correctly, your end marks like periods or question marks, exclamation points correctly? Then ask yourself, did I read and reread my sentences to check for errors or confusion, etc.? Sometimes if you reread a sentence, you'll notice you forgot a verb or it just really doesn't make sense. It might be a fragment, which means it's not a complete sentence. So check for that. Then has somebody else read my work and added any suggestions or revisions? This could be a friend, a sibling, a learning coach, a peer. It's always good to have a second set of eyes on your paper. And 5, have I reviewed the grading rubric or assignment details before submitting to ensure I'm submitting my best work? Oftentimes, in order to know how you will be graded, you can take a look at the rubric. Oftentimes, rubrics that are attached to the assignments will give you great detail on what to look for, what your teacher will look for when grading your assignments. So anyways, everybody, thank you so much for coming to this flipped preview video. I hope that these tips on writing narratives was helpful for you. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you in a flipped follow-up video to put this into practice. Thanks. Sincerely, Mrs. Alexander.